They said there was one conversation that even Socrates refused to repeat, a dialogue so dangerous that if spoken aloud, it could unmake the image Athens had crafted of itself, a dialogue that, according to a few trembling witnesses, should never be written, never remembered, and never spoken in the light. But someone did write it, and someone tried very hard to destroy it. The story begins on a warm evening in 399 BCE, only weeks before the trial that would forever divide the world between those who seek truth and those who fear it. Imagine a scroll hidden in the cracks beneath the Acropolis, sealed in wax and buried beneath a layer of dust. A scroll claiming that Socrates held a secret conversation, one not recorded by Plato, not recited by any student, not celebrated in any school. A dialogue whispered only once. Why? Because in that forbidden conversation, Socrates did something unthinkable. He asked whether the gods had already abandoned Athens, and whether the city's leaders knew it. To understand why that question frightened Athens more than an invading army, we need to return to the city as it was then, not a shining beacon of reason, but a wounded empire, limping after years of war. The Peloponnesian War had left the agora half-burned, the treasury nearly empty, and the people angry enough to accuse anyone of treachery. The democracy had been overthrown, restored, overthrown again, restored again, each cycle bloodier than the last. And walking through these streets, calm as a man strolling through a garden, was the one philosopher everyone watched but no one understood. Socrates. He spoke to fishermen, generals, merchants, and former tyrants with the same gentle sharpness. He questioned priests at the shrines, soldiers in the mess halls, and wealthy aristocrats in their marble homes. Some admired him. Some feared him. A few hated him enough to plot silence through legal means. But none of them, except maybe one, knew about the lost conversation. Its only surviving mention appears in a letter attributed to Critias, a man who had once been Socrates' student before joining the 30 tyrants. In the margins of this letter is a line written in a shaky hand. He spoke once of the oracle and of the desertion of the city. He should never have spoken so. What could Socrates have said that even a ruthless ruler like Critias believed was too dangerous? The answer begins the night Socrates was invited to a private gathering above the agora, inside the house of a wealthy sympathizer of the exiled oligarchs. According to one of the recovered fragments, Socrates was not supposed to attend. He simply walked in, uninvited, as though he had known the meeting was happening. There were no poets there, no students, only politicians, landowners, and men with enough influence to bend the courts. The moment he entered, the room fell silent. And then he asked his first question. What does a city become, he said, when its leaders care more for victory than for virtue? The question seemed harmless, philosophical, but the men in the room exchanged glances. Some shifted uncomfortably. At least one reached for his cloak, as though ready to leave. That's when Socrates spoke the sentence that, according to the fragment, froze the entire table. He said, "The Pythia no longer speaks for us." A blasphemy, a threat, a claim that Apollo's voice, Athens' most sacred advisor, had abandoned them. The men protested. They reminded Socrates that the Oracle of Delphi had once called him the wisest man in Greece. How could he now declare her silent? Socrates only smiled. Perhaps she grew tired, he answered, of a city that has forgotten how to listen. What followed was the dialogue Athens tried to erase. Socrates argued that the leaders of the city, democrats, and oligarchs alike, had turned the gods into political weapons. He accused the wealthy of hiding their corruption behind piety, and the politicians of invoking divine signs to justify cruel decisions. He named specific men. One of them, according to hints in the letter, may have been Anytus, a future accuser at his trial. And then Socrates went further. He claimed that the fall of the democracy, the violence of the oligarchs, and the return of the democracy again were all symptoms of something deeper. A moral collapse so complete that even the gods had withdrawn their protection. The room erupted in anger. Someone shouted that Socrates was undermining the city in a time of crisis. Another accused him of sympathizing with the exiled tyrants. Another, more quietly, warned him that such words could bring him before the courts. But Socrates did not stop. He asked them whether they could defend their honor before the Areopagus, the Council of Elders. He asked whether the gods could judge a city whose judges cared more for vengeance than justice. And then, according to the fragment, he asked the question that sealed his fate. Who benefits most, he said, when a city silences the man who asks the truth? The men present knew what that meant, and they knew they could not let that question reach the streets. One of them, perhaps drunk with fear, whispered the word hemlock. Socrates heard it. He simply nodded. The fragment ends here with one final scribble. If the council allows this conversation to spread, the foundations will crack. The rest of the scroll is lost or destroyed, but its disappearance matches too neatly with the accusations made weeks later. Impiety, corruption of the youth, disrespect of the gods. Almost as if the charges were built not on his public teachings, but on this forbidden dialogue. And so the question remains, did the men in that room create the trial, or merely accelerate what Socrates already knew was coming? Whatever the answer, the first part of the banned dialogue ends here, at the edge of a cliff, with the city preparing its case, and Socrates walking calmly toward his fate, as if he had seen it long before anyone else. They say Athens sleeps lightly. Every alley carries rumors. Every echo hides a name. And in the weeks after that forbidden gathering, the city began to whisper one name more than any other: Socrates. Not the Socrates standing in the agora. Not the man asking harmless questions to shoemakers and soldiers. But the Socrates who, according to the men at that private meeting, had crossed an invisible line. A line between philosophy and treason. The morning after that secret conversation, a message was carried, quietly, urgently, to the home of Anytus, a wealthy tanner and one of the most influential politicians in Athens. He was a man known for his temper, his patriotism, and his hatred for anything that smelled of oligarchic sympathies. He broke the wax seal. Read the report. Frowned. The note contained only 2 sentences. He spoke of the gods abandoning the city. And he named you in judgment. Those around Anytus said he crushed the parchment so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He already disliked Socrates. He had long believed the philosophers' public questions weakened the youth, turned them against their fathers, against tradition, against the city itself. But now he had something much stronger than suspicion. A conversation, a forbidden one, spoken behind closed doors, accusing Athens' leaders of moral decay. A conversation that could, if it spread, turn the people against the men who claimed to save them. Anytus knew exactly what such whispers could do. He had seen democracies fall to rumors before. He had helped restore one with his own hands. So he did what frightened men in powerful positions always do. He planned to bury the truth by burying the man who spoke it. Athens had no official secret police, but it had something far more effective. Networks of friends, clients, indebted merchants, paid informants, and loyalists who owed favors. Within 2 days, they were at work. A baker who often sold bread near the agora reported that Socrates had spoken critically of the gods. A wine seller swore he overheard the philosopher telling soldiers that divine signs were meaningless. A few young men, perhaps bribed, perhaps unsupervised, claimed Socrates mocked the sacred rites. None of this was written. None of it was verified. But Athens didn't operate on verification. It operated on fear. Meanwhile, deeper beneath the Acropolis, inside the quiet chambers of the Areopagus, another conversation was happening. The council elders had received fragments of the same report, that Socrates had declared the Pythia no longer spoke for Athens. This terrified them. If the oracle was silent, It meant the gods had withdrawn favor. If Socrates' word spread, public confidence in the state could collapse. Superstition would rise. Chaos would follow. To protect the city, they convinced themselves they had to silence the voice that threatened its unity. Not because he was wrong, but because he might be right. But there was someone else who heard about the forbidden dialogue. Someone who cared more deeply than anyone else. Plato. He wasn't at the secret meeting. He never saw the men shouting at Socrates. But he noticed something change in his teacher. Socrates had always walked slowly, but now he walked with purpose. He still questioned everyone, but now his questions had an edge, as if he were pushing against a wall he knew he could not break. Plato followed him closely, not as a student tracing a master, but as a man tracing a mystery. He saw strangers watching Socrates from a distance. He saw Anytus in the marketplace, speaking in hushed tones with men who ordinarily avoided him. He saw the priests at the shrines look away when Socrates approached. One evening, Plato asked him directly, "Is it true, Socrates? Did you speak against the gods?" Socrates smiled, a tired, almost fatherly smile. "I only asked," he replied, "whether we still honor them with truth or merely with habit." Plato's heart sank. He knew what that meant. Athens had sentenced men for far less. Word about the forbidden dialogue grew, but not publicly. It moved in silence, from elites to elites, like a secret too dangerous to speak openly. Merchants whispered that Socrates questioned the divine order. Generals whispered that he mocked the sacred omens before battle. Priests whispered that he dared to interpret the gods himself. By the fourth whisper, truth didn't matter. Fear did. Fear is louder than evidence. Fear feeds on itself. Fear doesn't need witnesses or testimonies. Fear simply needs direction. And Anytus was more than willing to give it. By the time the festival of the Anthesteria arrived, even Socrates' oldest friend, Chaerephon, sensed something was dangerously wrong. He pulled Socrates aside near the painted stoa. His voice trembled. "They are preparing something," he whispered. "Something final." But Socrates only touched his shoulder gently. "Do not fear what men decide," he said. "Fear only ignorance." Chaerephon wasn't satisfied. He warned him again, this time louder. "You must stop speaking. They think you are undermining the city." Socrates looked at him sadly, as though speaking to a man who could no longer see. "The city," Socrates said, "undermines itself when it refuses to be questioned." Those words spread, and they were added to the growing list of accusations. One night, in the dim light of an oil lamp, Plato wrote a note in the margins of his journal. That note would be found centuries later, barely legible. He spoke of a dialogue lost. A conversation they fear more than war. If he is tried, it will not be for what he has said, but for what he knows. And then Athens made its move. A formal complaint was drafted. Accusations were assembled. Witnesses, real or manufactured, were ready. Charges of impiety. Charges of corrupting the youth. Charges of disrespecting the gods. Behind every charge was the same hidden fear. What if Socrates was right? What if the gods really had abandoned Athens? The summons was sealed. The trial was set. And the forbidden dialogue remained unspoken, trapped in the minds of men terrified of its implications. But Socrates? He walked toward the court with the calm of a man who had already accepted the outcome. What he didn't know was that someone else had retrieved a fragment of that lost conversation, and that its survival would change the world. They say a man can sense when history is walking toward him. But Socrates did not walk toward history. History walked toward him, in the form of a summons, a charge sheet, and an entire city eager to convince itself that it was protecting virtue by condemning the one man, still asking what virtue meant. Yet what Athens did not know was this. A fragment of the forbidden dialogue had survived. Not in the hands of Socrates, not in the hands of the politicians, but in the hands of someone no one suspected, a young scribe named Diodorus. a quiet shadow in the background of Athenian politics. A man whose job was to record meetings, seal letters, and destroy anything the elites wished forgotten. But Diodorus did not destroy everything, and what he kept would later shake Athens and terrify the men who had arranged the trial. The morning after the charges were announced, Diodorus returned to the small stone chamber where he had secretly kept the fragment. It was not a full dialogue, only a sliver, a scrap, but it contained enough to make a man question everything Athens pretended to be. It read, "If a city punishes the one who questions it, then it is not the man who is guilty, but the city that is afraid." Diodorus knew the consequences of possessing such a text. He could be imprisoned, exiled, or worse. But he also knew the truth. Socrates had not spoken as an enemy of Athens. He had spoken like a physician diagnosing a disease no one wanted to admit existed. He saw corruption, hypocrisy, and a city worshiping its own illusions. And that terrified the men who thrived on those illusions. Trials in Athens were not quiet affairs. They were spectacles, massive performances where hundreds of jurors filed into the courts, ready to judge with emotion rather than evidence. And the trial of Socrates? It was the greatest performance of all. Outside the court, vendors sold figs, olives, and wine. Inside, the crowd murmured as if waiting for a play to begin. The air vibrated with expectation, tension, maybe even joy. Some people wanted to see a monster fall. Others came to witness a martyr rise. But the men who orchestrated the trial, Anytus, Miletus, and Lyco, wanted something far simpler: silence. They did not want Socrates' questions in the agora. They did not want his influence over the youth. And above all, they did not want the forbidden dialogue resurfacing. They needed him discredited, humiliated, destroyed. Plato stood near the back of the courtroom, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on his teacher. He had begged Socrates to prepare a defense, to appeal to emotion, to show humility, to plead for mercy. But Socrates had refused. "My life has been my defense," he had said. "I cannot lie now." Plato realized then that Socrates was not going to fight the charges. He was going to fight the city, not with violence, not even with anger, with truth, dangerous truth, truth pulled from that forbidden conversation, the one Plato was too afraid to ask about, yet too aware to ignore. Miletus, the youngest and most nervous of the accusers, rose first. He declared that Socrates corrupted the youth, denied the gods, and introduced new divinities. Socrates responded with a calmness that unsettled everyone. "Tell me, Miletus," he said, "how could I corrupt the youth when I never claimed to teach anything?" Laughter rippled through the room. The accusers' faces reddened. Then Socrates asked the question that struck like a blade. "If I corrupt them unintentionally, why punish me? Should not a mistake be corrected with instruction rather than execution?" The jurors murmured. Some nodded. Some frowned. Anytus clenched his jaw so tightly it trembled. Now Anytus stepped forward, not as a weak accuser, but as a wounded patriot. He spoke of war, of suffering, of democracy barely restored. He argued that Athens could not afford to tolerate voices that questioned its foundations. He never mentioned the forbidden dialogue, but his entire speech echoed its shadow. "A city must defend itself," he said, "from those who sow doubt in the divine order." Plato noticed something strange. Whenever Anytus spoke, he avoided looking directly at Socrates. Guilt, fear, or the knowledge that if he looked long enough, he might see the truth in the eyes of the man he demanded to kill. When Socrates rose again, he did something no one expected. He referenced subtly, indirectly, the forbidden dialogue. "I have spoken," he said, "only of the danger that arises when leaders forget virtue. Not gods abandoning the city, but men abandoning their duty." The room went silent. Anytus' face turned pale. Miletus fidgeted. Lyco looked at the doors, as if ready to flee. Because everyone knew Socrates was now dancing on the edge of revealing the truth, a truth that could destroy reputations, expose hidden abuses, and unravel carefully woven political alliances. Socrates paused. The room held its breath. He looked around at the judges, the citizens, the accusers, the crowd, leaning forward. And then he said, very quietly, "There are truths Athens dare not hear." A chill passed through the court. Everyone knew he was not talking about the public accusations. He was talking about something hidden, something whispered, something forbidden, something that, if spoken aloud, could ignite the city. At that moment, Anytus realized something. If Socrates continued speaking, the forbidden dialogue might surface. And if that happened, he would be the one judged. So he signaled, a small gesture, barely noticeable. But the allies he had planted among the jurors understood. They whispered. They nodded. They steered the vote before Socrates could speak again. When the results were announced, Plato felt his stomach twist. Guilty. By a narrow margin, but still guilty. And then came the most dangerous part, the sentence. Socrates could propose exile, or a fine, or a promise to avoid public questioning. It would have saved his life. Everyone waited. The jury leaned in. Plato silently begged. But Socrates smiled. "I propose," he said, "that the city reward me with free meals in the Prytanean as given to heroes." Gasps, shouts, fury. Anytus seized the moment. He demanded death. The vote came swiftly. Death. But as the court erupted, as the jurors shouted, as the accusers celebrated, one man slipped away quietly, Diodoros. Clutching the fragment of the forbidden dialogue, he knew what he had to do. He had to get out of Athens, before the men who condemned Socrates burned every trace of it. The verdict spread through Athens like smoke, slow, suffocating, impossible to escape. Socrates was condemned, not for denying the gods, not for corrupting the youth, but for something much older, deeper, and darker. He had seen too much. He had spoken too freely. And somewhere in the cracks of the city, a single fragment of that forbidden dialogue was now slipping away in the hands of a terrified scribe. But what no one knew, not Plato, not the accusers, not even Socrates, was that the trial unfolding in the public court was only the surface of a second trial, a hidden one, unrecorded by the historians of Athens. A trial of secrets, of influence, of survival. The trial of the lost and banned dialogue itself. Diodoros raced through the narrow alleyways behind the Odeon, clutching the fragment beneath his cloak. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a philosopher. He was a clerk, one of dozens trained to copy and destroy documents for the powerful. But he had seen a truth the others had not. Socrates wasn't being killed for impiety. He was being killed for heresy against the powerful. And this scrap of papyrus, worn at the edges, ink fading with age, held the reason why. The forbidden dialogue wasn't just dangerous because Socrates questioned the gods. It was dangerous because he questioned the leaders. He exposed the lie at the heart of the city, that men in power spoke of gods when it suited them, and abandoned them when it didn't. And those men were willing to kill to keep that hidden. Socrates waited. The cell was small, lit by a dim flame flickering against stone walls. But there was no fear on his face. If anything, there was clarity. As if, for the first time, he understood the full design of the world he had spent his life questioning. Plato sat beside him, trembling with anger. "They used lies," Plato said. "They twisted your words. They fear you." Socrates smiled softly. "They fear themselves." Plato didn't understand. Not yet. So Socrates explained, the only time he ever spoke of the forbidden dialogue after that night. "They believe the gods abandoned the city," he said, "because they no longer hear the truth. But it is they who have abandoned the gods by abandoning virtue." Plato's breath caught. "You mean everything they accuse you of is what they have done to themselves," Socrates finished. This was the real crime, not impiety, not corruption of youth, but forcing Athens to see its own reflection. And reflections can be dangerous. While Socrates accepted his fate, the accusers did not rest. The trial was not enough. The verdict was not enough. They needed to erase every trace of the forbidden dialogue. Every word, every memory, every whisper. Anytus summoned 2 guards loyal to him and issued a quiet order. Find the scribe. Find the scroll. End this. Night winds swept through the streets as the guards followed rumors, questioned merchants, bribed drunkards, and intimidated clerks. They learned of a young man seen running toward the pottery district. They tracked movement through the markets. They narrowed it down to a single name, Diodorus. And they found him. Diodorus was cornered near the Kerameikos, the cemetery road. 2 figures emerged from the darkness, their cloaks heavy, faces hidden. "Give us what you stole," one of them said. Diodorus stepped back, clutching the fragment. "I stole nothing. I only kept what was already truth." The guard raised a blade. Diodorus had no weapon, but he had something far stronger, resolve. "I won't let you bury his words." They lunged. He ran. Through abandoned workshops, past stacks of unbaked clay, into the shadowed streets of the outer district. One guard caught him by the cloak, ripping it open, sending the fragment slipping to the ground. A foot stamped down, but missed. Diodorus' dove seized the scrap and disappeared around a corner. He survived the night, barely, but he knew he couldn't stay in Athens. The city was closing in. The next morning, Plato received an unexpected knock at his door. Diodorus stood there, breathless, dirt-streaked, clutching something wrapped in cloth. "For you," he whispered. Plato hesitated. "What is it?" "It's his," Diodorus said. "The words they try to burn. The dialogue they fear." Plato unwrapped the cloth. There it was. A piece of the banned dialogue. A piece of the truth. The words were faint, some incomplete, but they carried the unmistakable voice of Socrates. They read, "A city that silences the man who thinks will fade into the shadows of those who never dared." Plato felt his pulse quicken. This was proof. Proof that the charges were political. Proof that Socrates was executed not for impiety, but for honesty. And proof that the leaders of Athens feared ideas more than enemies. "They will kill you for having this," Plato whispered. Diodorus nodded. "So keep it safe. Write it again. Hide it. Change it. Bury it. Just don't let the truth die with him." Plato swallowed hard and accepted the fragment. But the moment he closed the door, he felt a chilling truth. Socrates was no longer the only target. Now he held the most dangerous words in Athens. And the men who orchestrated the death sentence would not hesitate to orchestrate another. The poison was prepared, hemlock, bitter and cold. Socrates walked with calm steps to the cup. His students wept. Plato turned away, unable to watch. Socrates lifted the cup, smiled faintly, and said, "Let us begin the journey." The city had silenced the man, but had failed to silence the words. Because somewhere in the hills outside Athens, Diodorus rode toward exile. Somewhere in his cloak, hidden from the city, hidden from the accusers, hidden from history, was the last surviving fragment of the forbidden dialogue. A fragment that would decide the fate of generations. And in Athens, someone else had realized this escape. Someone dangerous. Someone powerful. Someone coming for the truth Plato now guarded. The cell is quiet. Too quiet. Socrates sits cross-legged on the cold stone floor, the dim torchlight flickering across the walls like shadows of forgotten gods. Outside, the guards shuffle. Athens sleeps. The hemlock cup waits on a small wooden table. But before he drinks it, before the city ends the life of its most inconvenient citizen, he speaks one last time. A final dialogue. A dialogue that never appeared in Plato's writings. A dialogue the city erased. And it begins with a whisper. "Before I die," Socrates says, "I must tell one more truth." The guards let a man slip in. Hooded. Silent. A man the official records never mention. Not Plato. Not Crito. Not Apollodorus, but someone else. A member of the Council of 500, a man who approved the death sentence. Someone who now regrets it. He speaks quickly, voice trembling. Socrates, you were condemned not for corrupting the youth, nor for impiety. Those were facades. You know this. We did it because you touched a truth we cannot allow to exist. Socrates smiles. I merely ask questions. Exactly, the man hisses. And with those questions, you uncovered our great fear. What fear? Socrates asks. The man steps closer, lowering his hood. You expose the illusion upon which every city, ours, and all future ones, depends. Socrates waits. The man continues. People believe they live under laws. But in truth, they live under the stories we attach to those laws. Socrates tilts his head. Stories. Yes, the man breathes. Stories we craft about honor, order, duty, justice. Not justice itself, but the performance of justice. He trembles. You peeled away the theater. You show the youth that laws are merely agreements, and agreements can be questioned, changed, dismantled. The visitor swallows hard. You turn the city's sacred rules into opinions. Do you understand the danger in that? Socrates looks at him with gentle amusement. You fear that if people discover laws are not divine, they will stop obeying them. The man nods vigorously. Exactly. Without belief, a city collapses. Without shared fictions, nothing binds men together. Socrates raises one eyebrow. So you ban the truth in order to preserve stability? The visitor slumps against the wall. Yes. Silence fills the cell. Then Socrates asks, and what a virtue? The man flinches. Socrates presses on. Is stability more valuable than truth? Is order more precious than the soul's freedom? Is a peaceful lie better than a painful truth? The man's voice cracks. We could not let you continue. Your questions were dissolving the foundations of Athens. For a long moment, Socrates says nothing. Then, softly, if your laws cannot withstand questions, then they are not laws. They are cages. The visitor looks away. And if your city collapses simply because someone asks, what is justice? Then perhaps it was unjust from the beginning. The man clenches his fists. You don't understand. Your death is necessary. Socrates smiles gently. I know. The man looks up, startled. Socrates continues. Athens is not killing me. It is revealing itself. The visitor whispers. Will you at least tell me why you continued? Why you kept questioning even when death was certain? Socrates stands, walks to the table, lifts the cup, its surface trembling with the poison. He turns to the man with a soft, almost paternal smile. Because truth does not depend on permission. He raises the cup to his lips, and in the moment before he drinks, he speaks his final line, a line no Athenian scribe dared preserve. To question power is to honor the soul. With that, he drinks. The visitor flees into the night. He tells no one what he heard, but something about that final dialogue, that forbidden exchange, survives. Not in scrolls, not in official histories, but in a rumor. A rumor that Socrates died not because he corrupted the youth, but because he revealed a secret. Laws are not sacred. Only truth is, and truth is dangerous. So dangerous that Athens killed a man for speaking it. So dangerous that they banned his final dialogue. So dangerous that even now, 2,400 years later, it feels like a message meant for us. A message still whispering through time. Ask everything.